In the summer of 1944, German generals studying their maps in France were baffled. The American army was advancing too fast. Its tanks were everywhere, across fields, through villages, racing toward the German border at a speed that defied logic. And yet, what stunned them wasn't the firepower. It was the fuel. No army in history had ever moved so far, so fast, with so many machines. By all calculations, the Americans should have run dry weeks ago. But they didn't. Behind the thunder of Patton's tanks roared something even more powerful, an invisible force made of grease, rubber, and sweat. They called it the Red Ball Express, a supply line so relentless that it turned highways into rivers of motion, keeping 28 divisions fed, fueled, and fighting. This is the story of how truck drivers, many of them young, black, and unheralded, turned America's logistical dream into a reality so unstoppable that it left even the German high command speechless. When the Allied forces broke out of Normandy in August 1944, the war in Western Europe changed overnight. What had been a slow, grinding crawl through hedgerows became a sprint. After weeks of being pinned down in tight, muddy fields, American tanks suddenly burst into open country. Patton's Third Army led the charge, ripping through German defenses and sending entire divisions retreating in chaos. But with every mile gained, a new problem grew worse: logistics. Modern war runs on fuel, and Patton's armored columns were burning it faster than anyone could deliver it. Each Sherman tank consumed roughly 1 gallon per mile. His army was moving hundreds of miles across France. Every advance deep into enemy territory meant the supply lines stretched thinner and thinner, back through destroyed bridges, cratered roads, and jammed ports. The ports themselves were the heart of the crisis. Normandy's beaches had served as a temporary lifeline, but the major ports like Cherbourg and Le Havre were still clogged or destroyed. The Allies could not bring in supplies fast enough, and once they landed, getting them to the front was another nightmare. The U.S. Army had planned for methodical, cautious progress, not for Patton's lightning advance. Every tank, truck, and half-track screamed for fuel. The barrels and jerry cans stacked behind the lines were vanishing at an alarming rate. Mechanics were siphoning gasoline from abandoned vehicles, drivers were sleeping behind the wheel just to save time. If the flow stopped for even a day, the offensive would collapse. In early August, supply officers in France faced a terrifying possibility: Patton's army might have to halt, not because of German resistance, but because they literally ran out of gas. The solution would have to be as fast and improvisational as the general himself. On August 25, 1944, the U.S. Army Transportation Corps issued a radical order, a 700-mile round-the-clock supply route stretching from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines near the Seine and beyond. Every available truck, every spare driver, and every gallon of fuel would be thrown into motion. They called it the Red Ball Express, a name borrowed from the railroads back home that marked express cargo trains with red balls painted on their sides. Within days, an entire network of roads was designated for the operation. These routes were closed to civilian and other military traffic, only Red Ball trucks could use them. Directional signs marked the path, and military police manned intersections to keep the convoy moving. The highways of northern France transformed into a living artery of war, a continuous flow of vehicles carrying food, ammunition, spare parts, and, above all, fuel. The men behind the wheel were the unsung heroes of the Allied advance. More than 75% of them were African American soldiers serving in segregated units, men who had trained in obscurity and often been assigned to non-combat roles. Now, suddenly, they were at the heart of the most vital operation in Europe. Day and night, in convoys stretching for miles, they drove deuce-and-a-half trucks, the 2.5-ton GMC workhorses of the U.S. Army. The road conditions were brutal. Rain turned the fields into swamps, German air attacks lurked overhead, breakdowns were constant. Some convoys were ambushed, others crashed in the dark, and drivers often went without sleep for 36 hours straight. But the mission never stopped. Each truck carried its precious cargo, fuel cans stacked to the brim, ammunition cases, or crates of rations, and every mile forward meant the difference between victory and stalemate. Drivers learned to fix their own engines on the move, to navigate by the stars, and to push their trucks beyond limits they were never designed for. By September, the Red Ball Express was running nearly 6,000 trucks per day, delivering 12,000 tons of supplies to the front. The system was so efficient that Patton's tanks were refueled in the field as if by magic. Soldiers joked that if a Sherman ran dry, all you had to do was wait 5 minutes, a Red Ball truck would appear. To the German generals watching from their command posts, it was incomprehensible. They had spent decades mastering the art of blitzkrieg, speed and supply working in harmony, yet now it was the Americans who had mastered that rhythm. Their tanks rolled not because of superior design, but because of logistics on a scale the world had never seen. Every can of gasoline, every box of bullets, every meal that reached the front had come from those convoys. And the drivers, invisible to history for decades, were the beating heart behind the roar of Patton's armored divisions. The Germans thought they were fighting soldiers. They were also fighting truck drivers. The Red Ball Express wasn't a plan that came out of neat military doctrine, it was born out of desperation. Within days of its creation, the highways of France turned into an unending blur of motion. Trucks thundered across the countryside, day and night, their headlights blacked out to avoid German planes. They carried everything: gasoline in jerry cans, artillery shells stacked to the roof, crates of rations, medical supplies, and even mail. The mission was simple: keep Patton's Third Army moving, no matter what. The convoy system was a feat of organization unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Each truck was numbered, each route color-coded, each checkpoint timed to the minute. Red Ball routes ran in a strict loop, one road for eastbound loaded trucks, another for empty ones returning west. The convoys were spaced out in 5-minute intervals, with military police stationed at intersections to prevent gridlock. A single breakdown could snarl the entire flow, so mechanics rode along in spare trucks, ready to fix engines under fire. In total, over 6,000 trucks moved every day. By early September, the Red Ball Express was delivering more than 12,000 tons of supplies daily, enough to sustain an army of nearly 250,000 men. The logistics officers who had once feared catastrophe now found themselves running the most efficient supply chain in modern history. But efficiency came at a cost. The men behind the wheel bore the burden. Most were African American soldiers, drivers, mechanics, and loaders, serving in segregated units that had long been dismissed as non-combat essential. Yet the irony was brutal: in 1944, these men were suddenly more essential than anyone else. They slept in their trucks, ate cold rations, and drove through mud, dust, and fire without pause. Rest stops were rare, showers almost non-existent. They nicknamed the trucks Deuces, or Jimmies, and treated them like family, because breaking down meant not only failure, but danger. The Red Ball drivers raced against exhaustion as much as the enemy. Convoys rolled 24 hours a day, with drivers rotating in shifts that blurred together. Many were so fatigued they kept cigarettes burning down to their fingers to stay awake. Some tied the steering wheel to their belts so they wouldn't slump forward asleep. "We didn't stop," one driver recalled later. "If you broke down, you fixed it and caught up. You never stopped driving. Never." The roads themselves were treacherous. Bomb craters dotted the highways, burned-out tanks and wrecked trucks lined the ditches. German aircraft, though weakened, still struck when they could. The Luftwaffe hunted convoys from the air, strafing the highways in low passes. Drivers learned to scatter, using smoke screens and camouflage nets to hide the convoys. Even after the skies cleared, the danger didn't end. Snipers and small pockets of German resistance lingered in the forests, waiting for easy targets. And yet, morale remained astonishingly high. Many of these soldiers, denied the chance to fight on the front lines because of their race, took immense pride in their work. They knew they were the lifeblood of the army. Without them, Patton's tanks were just steel statues. The driver's sense of mission grew into a fierce pride, a badge of honor earned on every run. They gave the convoys nicknames: suicide runs, hot roads, midnight specials. Some trucks were painted with names like Mississippi Queen or Rolling Thunder. Others bore pinups or slogans scrawled across their hoods. In the cab, jazz and blues records played on portable phonographs. For brief moments between danger and exhaustion, there was laughter, camaraderie, and the rare luxury of a shared smoke under the stars. Even officers began to realize that what they had created was more than a logistics network, it was a phenomenon. A living, breathing artery connecting the beaches of Normandy to the heart of France. At its peak, the Red Ball Express used 75% of all available U.S. trucks in Europe. The numbers were staggering: 23,000 men in rotation, 900,000 tons of cargo moved in just 3 months, a new truck passing a given point every 25 seconds. The rhythm of the Red Ball Express became the rhythm of the war itself, a pounding, relentless beat that carried the Allies forward. But the strain on the system grew with every mile. Trucks wore out faster than they could be repaired. Tires shredded on the rough roads. Engines overheated. And the drivers, deprived of rest, sometimes made fatal mistakes. Accidents were common. Some trucks simply vanished into the darkness, their cargo never arriving. In places, burned-out wrecks marked the side of the road like grim reminders of what kept the army alive. Still, the convoy never stopped. Orders were clear: if one truck fell, another took its place. If one driver was lost, another stepped up. The system was bigger than any single man, and that was exactly how the U.S. Army designed it. Patton, ever impatient, barely acknowledged the miracle behind his advance. To him, fuel was simply something that must arrive, as inevitable as sunrise. But his staff officers knew better. They watched in awe as the Red Ball Express kept pace with the fastest-moving army in the world. German intelligence officers couldn't understand it. They intercepted radio chatter, studied captured vehicles, and analyzed the pace of the American offensive. The numbers didn't make sense. No army could move so far without collapsing under its own weight. "The Americans fight like rich men," one German colonel remarked. "They have more gasoline than we have soldiers." The truth was stranger than that. It wasn't money or technology that kept the Americans moving, it was an army of ordinary men behind the wheel, racing through darkness, pushing themselves past exhaustion. By mid-September, Patton's tanks were nearing the German border. The offensive had turned into a triumph of logistics as much as combat. The Red Ball Express had become a legend, though few at the time realized it. The drivers didn't think of themselves as heroes. They just kept the engines running. They didn't have the luxury of stopping to admire history. They were too busy making it. By late September 1944, the Red Ball Express was operating beyond anything the U.S. Army had ever imagined. What had begun as a stopgap measure, a temporary fix to keep Patton's tanks fueled, had become a colossal operation stretching across 2 countries. It was a victory of organization, willpower, and sheer human endurance. But now, as the Allied front approached the borders of Germany, the limits of that endurance were beginning to show. Every system has a breaking point, and the Red Ball Express was approaching its own. The trucks that had thundered across France for weeks without rest were falling apart. Tires shredded, engines blew, transmissions locked. Dust and gravel ground into gears, while the constant strain of overloading turned the sturdy GMC Deuce-and-a-half trucks into mechanical wrecks. Mechanics worked around the clock in makeshift depots, scavenging parts from wrecked vehicles and improvising repairs with whatever they had. Oil drums became spare fuel tanks. Metal from wrecks was welded into fenders. It wasn't pretty, but it kept the wheels turning. Fuel, the very thing they were hauling, became scarce even for the convoys themselves. Trucks carried just enough to make the round trip, and every drop was rationed. Drivers learned to coast down hills in neutral, to save a few precious gallons for the long return. Many ran their trucks until they sputtered to a halt, then siphoned gasoline from wrecks to keep going. Every mile closer to Germany felt like a gamble against the laws of physics and luck. Then came the weather. The clear skies of summer gave way to autumn rain. Roads turned to rivers of mud, and tires spun uselessly in deep ruts. The famous red ball route signs, once gleaming beacons along the highway, were now half buried in muck. Convoys slowed to a crawl, headlights dimmed under blackout orders. Drivers leaned forward, squinting through slits of visibility, their nerves stretched to breaking. And the enemy was still out there. The Luftwaffe, though weakened, continued to strike in sudden, savage bursts. German fighters strafed convoys from treetop level, their machine guns stitching lines of fire across the columns. When that failed, German saboteurs mined the roads or ambushed drivers in isolated sections. Some trucks vanished into the dark forests of northern France, never to be seen again. For the men behind the wheel, it wasn't just fatigue or weather that haunted them, it was the knowledge that death could come from the air at any moment. Despite it all, the convoys kept rolling. Their unofficial motto became, "Through hell or high water, we deliver." The pressure came not just from the enemy but from the clock. Patton refused to slow down. His advance across France had been so swift that even the most efficient supply system in history struggled to keep up. Every day he radioed headquarters demanding more fuel, more ammunition, more everything. His tanks were so far ahead of schedule that supply officers joked he was driving faster than the trucks could dream. The logistical miracle that had fueled his success was now threatening to strangle itself. In early September, for the first time, the Red Ball Express began to falter. Truck losses mounted, fuel deliveries dipped. There simply weren't enough drivers, trucks, or spare parts to sustain the pace. Some convoys failed to reach their destinations. Patton's spearheads, once unstoppable, began to slow. Tanks that had thundered through France now sat idle on the roadside, out of gas. But even as the system buckled, ingenuity stepped in. The Army Transportation Corps began experimenting with new methods, mobile fuel dumps closer to the front, night-only routes to avoid congestion, and leapfrog supply techniques that prefigured modern logistics. Convoys began to coordinate not just with tank units but with engineers, artillery, and even air supply. It was a war not just of weapons but of organization. Still, the strain showed. The drivers were exhausted beyond reason. Many had been behind the wheel for more than 1,500 miles in a single week. Accidents were brutal and frequent: overturned trucks, head-on collisions, burned-out wrecks. Military records later revealed that the Red Ball Express had a higher casualty rate than some frontline units. Yet the drivers rarely complained. When asked why they kept going, one simply said, "Because the tanks can't move without us." It was in these moments of crisis that the true scope of the Red Ball Express became clear. This wasn't just a supply line, it was a living network of men improvising heroism under impossible pressure. When trucks ran dry, other convoys doubled up. When roads washed out, they forged new ones through the fields. In some cases, bulldozers literally carved temporary roads alongside the main highways just to keep traffic flowing. Every challenge was met with a solution, every delay with determination. By mid-September, the convoys had delivered nearly 500,000 tons of supplies, a number so vast that even Patton himself had to acknowledge it. "My men can eat, fight, and drive because of you," he told a group of Red Ball drivers during a brief stop. It was a rare moment of praise from a man known for expecting the impossible. Yet the operation couldn't continue forever. The front was moving too fast, too far, and the strain on both men and machines had become unbearable. Supply officers began planning to shut down the Red Ball routes once railroads and captured ports could take over. The drivers didn't know it, but their grueling work was nearing its end. Still, for the moment, the trucks rolled on. Their headlights glowed faintly in the rain, their engines groaned with exhaustion, and their drivers fought sleep with sheer will. Each convoy that made it through meant another day of advance, another village liberated, another German retreat. They were running on fumes. But those fumes were enough to change the course of the war. By October 1944, the Red Ball Express had become more than a supply route, it was the heartbeat of the Allied advance. Every highway in northern France seemed to pulse with the rhythm of engines, gears, and determination. At its peak, nearly 900,000 tons of supplies had been moved in less than 3 months. It was an achievement so staggering that even Eisenhower himself called it the backbone of the campaign. But the Red Ball was more than statistics, it was proof that an army could run not only on courage, but on coordination. The landscape of France bore the marks of that effort. Along every major road, dust hung thick in the air, rising in great brown clouds that could be seen for miles. The endless convoys formed a kind of mechanical river, 6,000 trucks a day, spaced just minutes apart, roaring eastward with the smell of oil and sweat trailing behind them. The sight was so mesmerizing that villagers gathered by the roadside just to watch it pass, waving at the drivers, tossing apples, or shouting "Vive l'Amérique" as the columns thundered on. Inside the cabs, life was a blur of repetition. Drivers leaned forward, their hands raw from gripping the wheel, their eyes rimmed red with fatigue. The same rations, the same jokes, the same rain-soaked uniforms day after day. Yet beneath the exhaustion ran a deep sense of purpose. Every man knew that the faster they drove, the sooner the war might end. And so, they drove. By now, the Red Ball Express was a self-contained city in motion. Mechanics followed the convoys in rolling repair shops. Field kitchens were set up at rest points, offering steaming mugs of coffee to drivers who could barely stand. Military police kept traffic flowing like clockwork, armed with whistles and batons, directing the endless tide of vehicles. If a truck broke down, it was pushed to the side within minutes, its load transferred to another. Nothing stopped the flow, not weather, not fatigue, not even the enemy. In some areas, the Red Ball routes ran so close to the front that drivers could hear artillery in the distance. Shells occasionally whistled overhead, but the convoys rarely stopped. If you were hit, one driver said, you prayed it wasn't the gas truck in front of you. Many didn't wear helmets, they needed their ears uncovered to listen for mechanical trouble. Others drove barefoot to feel the vibration of their engines better. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense, they were men of instinct, grit, and improvisation, fighting their war with wrenches and wheels instead of rifles. By late October, the Allied advance began to slow, not from lack of courage, but because the front had simply outpaced its supply lines. Even with all its miracles, the Red Ball Express could only stretch so far. The trucks were pushing into Belgium now, their engines worn thin, their drivers reaching their limits. But new opportunities opened up. Ports that had once been wrecked by retreating Germans, Cherbourg, Le Havre, Antwerp, were being repaired. Railroads were coming back online. The great logistical machine of the Allies was shifting from the desperate improvisation of the summer to the organized efficiency of industrial warfare. This didn't mean the Red Ball was finished, it meant it had succeeded. The system became the model for all future operations. Engineers used lessons from the Red Ball to redesign fuel delivery, creating pipeline-forward systems that could move gasoline underground instead of by truck. Supply routes were renamed, reorganized, and expanded, but the DNA of the Red Ball Express remained in every one of them. It had shown what could be done with determination, ingenuity, and human endurance. Still, for the men who drove it, those victories came at a personal cost. The toll was written not in headlines, but in the haunted eyes of drivers who had gone weeks without proper rest. Many never fully recovered from the exhaustion. Some had permanent hearing damage from the constant roar of engines, others bore scars from accidents that blurred into memory. They didn't see themselves as heroes, they were just doing a job. But history would later recognize them as something more. And among them, the unsung heroes stood out most, the African American soldiers who made up nearly 3/4 of the Red Ball Express. In an era when the military was still segregated, these men proved their worth beyond question. They faced racism from within their own ranks but answered it with performance so flawless that even the skeptics had to bow to the results. Many officers later admitted that without those drivers, Patton's Third Army would have ground to a halt. One lieutenant wrote home, "These boys don't have medals or parades. But they keep the war alive. They're the arteries that carry the blood to the front." For months, the Germans had mocked the American army as soft, dependent on machines, slow to adapt, incapable of true blitzkrieg. But now, it was the Germans who watched in disbelief as the Allies executed a mechanized miracle of their own. They had laughed at American logistics, now they were running from it. Even Hitler's generals were forced to concede. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, in a report to Berlin, described the American advance as a tide of steel and fuel, fed by an unseen river. That unseen river was the Red Ball Express. By late November, the convoy routes began to taper off. The trucks that had once roared through France were reassigned, the signs along the highways taken down. Some drivers stayed on, others rotated home. But the story of the Red Ball Express didn't fade with the winter, it became part of the legend of victory itself. In a war that celebrated tanks, bombers, and generals, it was the drivers, the men no one noticed, who made it possible. Their wheels turned faster than history could record them. Their sweat carried armies across continents. And their legacy would last long after the dust settled on Europe's roads. The highways they built were more than asphalt, they were monuments to human endurance, to teamwork, and to a truth the Germans never understood, that the strength of an army lies not only in its guns, but in its ability to keep moving forward. The Red Ball Express didn't just fuel Patton's Blitz. It fueled the very idea of victory itself. When winter settled over Europe in late 1944, the roads that had once thundered with trucks grew quiet. The Red Ball Express, this relentless artery of fuel, food, and ammunition, had done its job. Rail lines had reopened, ports were flowing again, and the Allied supply network was now a masterpiece of industrial coordination. The convoys began to thin out, their trucks reassigned to new routes, their drivers sent to other duties. But for those who had lived inside that rolling storm of engines and courage, the silence felt strange. After months of roaring roads, the stillness of peace was almost unsettling. The official shutdown came in November. Orders were issued, the Red Ball Express would cease operations as of November 16, 1944. By then, its record was staggering, nearly 900,000 tons of supplies delivered, 6 million miles driven, and tens of thousands of individual runs completed. What had begun as a desperate improvisation had turned into one of the greatest logistical feats in military history. It had kept the Allied spearhead alive at a time when it should have stalled. But the legacy of the Red Ball Express didn't end with its final convoy. In many ways, that was only the beginning. For the African American drivers who made up nearly 3/4 of its manpower, the Red Ball Express became something deeply personal. In a military still divided by segregation, they had been handed one of the war's most vital responsibilities, and they had delivered. Their success stood as a quiet but undeniable challenge to the prejudice that surrounded them. Commanders who had doubted them before the operation now publicly acknowledged that without these men, the Allied advance would have collapsed. One general wrote, "They may not wear combat ribbons, but they won the war with their engines." That line spread among the drivers, becoming an unofficial badge of pride. When many of those men returned home after the war, they brought that pride with them. They had proved, in the hardest conditions imaginable, that skill, discipline, and courage had nothing to do with the color of a uniform, or the skin inside it. Historians would later trace the beginnings of the post-war desegregation of the U.S. military to the example set by the Red Ball Express. What had started as a logistical miracle had quietly become a social one. For the commanders, the lessons were equally lasting. The Red Ball Express had shown that wars could be won not just by destroying the enemy, but by outsupplying him. It redefined how military planners thought about logistics. The U.S. Army studied the operation for years afterward, using it as the foundation for what would become the modern supply doctrine, the very system that would later fuel wars in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Every Army truck that rolled across foreign soil after 1945 carried, in its lineage, a piece of the Red Ball Express. And for the men who drove those trucks, the memories stayed sharp. Decades later, veterans could still recall the smell of diesel, the vibration of engines, the glare of headlights against endless roads. They remembered the exhaustion, how they'd driven until their hands cramped around the wheel, but they also remembered the laughter, the songs, the jokes shouted from truck to truck as they sped through the French countryside. It was crazy, one driver said years later. We didn't know if we'd live through it, but we knew we were part of something bigger than any one of us. In the years after the war, movies and books celebrated Patton's daring tactics, the courage of the infantry, the precision of the airmen. But the Red Ball Express remained a quieter story, a story told in engine noise and sweat, in nights without sleep and miles without end. Only later did the world begin to grasp how much had depended on those men who kept the trucks moving. The Germans never truly understood it. During the war, their intelligence reports described the American advance as logistically impossible. Even after surrender, captured German generals expressed disbelief that the Allies had managed to maintain such a supply rate. One officer reportedly said, "We did not lose to tanks or planes. We lost to your gasoline." That gasoline had a name, and it was Red Ball. In the decades that followed, reunions were held. Old drivers, gray-haired now, met again to remember those long nights on the road. They laughed about the near misses, the breakdowns, the ridiculous things they'd carried, chickens, letters from home, even one time a crate of French wine meant for a general's mess. But when they spoke of the convoys themselves, the tone changed. There was reverence in their voices, a recognition that for a brief, extraordinary moment, they had driven history forward with their own hands. The roads they once raced along are quiet now. Grass has grown over the ditches where trucks once bogged down in mud. The Red Ball insignia, the circle with a bold arrow through it, faded from the highway signs long ago. But in a few places in France, small memorials remain, plaques that read, simply, "To the men of the Red Ball Express, who kept freedom moving." Those words capture what the operation really was. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic in the traditional sense. It was thousands of ordinary men doing something extraordinary, turning chaos into coordination, exhaustion into momentum, and war into motion. The German generals who once laughed at American logistics never understood the power of that kind of will. They didn't understand that an army built on teamwork, trust, and a little engine grease could achieve the impossible. When the last convoy shut down its engines and the final truck rolled to a stop, the men of the Red Ball Express didn't just end a mission. They left behind a legacy that would outlast the war itself, a legacy of endurance, ingenuity, and unity. Because sometimes, history isn't written by those who fire the guns. It's written by those who keep the wheels turning.